My name is Meir Vilnaye Shapiro. I was born in Vilna, June 28, 1926. I lived there for 17 years, 15 years in freedom, relative freedom, and 2 years under Nazi occupation. To me, personally, Vilna was the Jerusalem, because it was a vibrant city full of vitality, brimming with Jewish life. In pre-war Vilna, out of the population of 240,000, 1/3 was Jewish. When the war broke out with Poland in 1939, we happened to be on one of those summer homes not far from Vilna. And of course there was panic, but at that point the Germans only occupied the western part of Poland. Okay, so we had an influx of refugees, and I remember once, when I went out in the evening to do some sort of an errand, when I was about to go up back to our apartment, it was an evening dark, and there was one man, asking me if I know of a place where to stay, and I was so moved by him because he was a Jewish man. We brought him up, and I remember very clearly my mother served him a certain homemade marmalade, that she used to make, and with bread and tea or coffee or cocoa. And he stayed over one night with us, slept over, and then in the morning apparently he pursued, some other goals where he wanted to go, We knew that there was a lot brewing there and a lot of anti-Semitism, anti-Jewishness, because he couldn't even convert and be free of persecution in Germany. We did not know what the political situation was. And usually people, become conflicted. And I remember experiencing this conflict later on, with my parents, go, not go, that sort of thing. Well, that was there, the Western Poland. Here we are still secure. The Russians came in. I remember for a short period, I missed my American movies, because that was abolished immediately, And of course we had to stand in line immediately to buy a loaf of bread. The winter of 1941, we came back to Vilna. We got a beautiful apartment overlooking gardens and beautiful trees, and always what stands out in my mind is the lilacs during the month of May. It was on a Sunday, June 22nd, I believe. And as we were heading towards the boat depot, on the river, we heard sirens in the air. We thought it was a drill, perhaps. We went into shelter, but when we came out, we realized it was not a drill, because there was bombardment. And shells didn't fall into the city, but we heard the cannonades all over the city, And of course, the radio announced it was war. Germans have attacked. And within 3 days, the Germans came into Vilna, and the fate of the Jews was sealed. And then there was a group that got to be known in Yiddish, the Chapunes. Chapunes, that comes from the Yiddish word chappen, which means to seize, to catch. And they were literally like, for what I remember before, like the dog catchers. They sometimes walked the streets and they looked actually to spot a Jew and beat him up, tear his hair out. I know we had a neighbor, one day he showed up with part of his hair torn out of his scalp. My father was always a very skillful mechanic, hands-on engineer. He at that time worked in a brewery, beer brewery, and he started some sort of a job which he was indispensable. He had to finish it. So the Germans, they were always beer lovers, you know. Of course, we need you. You know, wir brauchen dich, Jude, you know. So they issued him a Schein, that's German, but it's really a work certificate, you know. So in a way he was exempt from assaults and persecution. Of course, we did not anticipate the atrocities that would befall us, you know. And late summer, they decreed that every Jew must leave his apartment, take what you can, and march into this designated area or section of the city, which was the old city, Yiddish city, you know. And of course, they already built up gates. They barricaded off, you know, with walls, you know, the streets where we would be. And we could not understand how 75,000 Jews would fit in there. But of course, we learned very fast. Only about, I don't know, maybe half or maybe less than half, I don't know numbers, were squeezed in there. The rest were massacred. All my cousins, all my aunts, and all my uncles were massacred over there. The Germans had what they call Aktionen, or in Yiddish, Akties. It was actually what it meant is really like a selection roundup or cleansing, what they call now in Bosnia. They would decide anyone who is unemployed, doesn't have any certificate, you go to the left, the remainder stays to the right, and that's how they would thin out, and they would all eventually march to the mass grave of Panar. It's almost like what you see around here. You cannot stand and cry. As I said before, you become numb, you become fearful, you know, paralyzed or anything else, but you don't stand and cry. And of course, during an inspection, the German military man, I don't know if he was, I don't think he was SS, he gave me a good beating, you know. And I remember I took it coolly. I don't even remember anger. But eventually, they liquidated the ghetto, and at that time, we all tried to escape one way or another. Towards the end of the day, they took us to the trains, cattle cars, you know, typical that you sometimes see in the movies, you know. They packed us in there. By that time, it was already dark, and I don't know, it must have been close to 11 o'clock or so at night, and there's some panic. You know, I fell asleep. And then there was panic. I was awakened by panic in the car, train car. Hey, someone spotted in the dark through that small window. Some people started to crawl out that small window, eject themselves out of the running train. It wasn't running very fast, I must say. And I followed suit. Ejected myself first, head and shoulders sitting, and then out I went, and I fell on my back on the opposite tracks, you know, which was going in the other direction. I got up and I started to roam the fields, you know, just heading. There was a very moonlit light at night, you know, I remember it very distinctly. And I started to walk and towards back, you know, along the tracks, but at a certain distance, so that in case this tracks, you know, would be guarded by someone, you know. And I was heading back to the city. Where am I going to go? I was thinking at that time of a woman whom we called Die Schwarze Goye. And she was hiding out my Aunt Frida, my mother's sister, for some time. I remember I approached a Lithuanian policeman standing down a corner on his beat. My yellow star was torn off from my coat. I would not wear that anymore, trying to walk the street as if I were one of the population, the non-Jewish population. And I whistled the Blue Danube Waltz by Strauss to give an aura of casualty, not casualty, casualness, okay? Passed them by, didn't stop me, okay. And I found this woman, I entered, she knew who I was, and I explained what happened. She was very, very afraid. She could be arrested and shot to death for anyone who was hiding out a Jew, you know. And she said, you know something, there's still here a remnant of the ghetto a few blocks away from here. It's called Kailis. Well, during the night, I tried to climb over the fence into this camp. The camp it actually wasn't a camp. It was one big building, I think about 4 or 5 stories, that's all. And that's where all the Jews lived. So I stayed temporarily, and sure enough, there was a roundup. A few people escaped and joined the partisans. So in fact, the consul, the Jewish consul at that time, had a problem. Where do we find substitutes? So I became the guard, because that fellow who escaped was a guard at the gate. I put on a ribbon here, blue and white ribbon, and I became a guard, and my name was Itzek Moskowitz, because I was supposed to be him. And they insisted, of course, that we, the guard, so to say, go and help the Germans find out in case there are hideouts. Instead, I remember running upstairs, downstairs, and avoiding confronting the Germans so that they wouldn't spot me and ask me questions, what am I doing? I was just running, and every time I saw a kid, I would say, hide yourself. I don't know, I cannot do anything here. I'm just running around like, like I'm poisoned myself, Well, eventually, Kailis was also liquidated. And that was, I believe, late or early summer 1944. So of course, by that time, there was nowhere, to run to. So I went along, wherever they take us. They say we go to a labor camp. They packed us into, again, those transport cattle cars, for freight cars. Then later on, when we reached the concentration camp Kaiserwald in Riga, Latvia, and they stripped us of our clothes, the civilian clothes, and cut our hair, and they gave us the striped flannel clothes, bluish, gray, with some sort of a shirt underneath, and herded us into barracks, And I felt at that time, my God, this is the end. There's no escape from here. I lost my chance, I said. What? As long as I was out there, why didn't I escape? Why didn't I felt it was the end. And the brutality, not so much from the Germans or the guards, but from the inmates. There were some, criminals actually who were in charge. They were called the kapos. They could pick out anyone whom they didn't like during roll call, appel, they used to call it. And in one case, they threw him into the outhouse, meaning the toilet, where it's basically a pit full of feces. Threw him in and alive there. It was so horrible. Apparently, the Russians were coming closer because they decided to evacuate the camp. And they put us on a march on foot to, I guess, the nearest depot, train depot. And of course, again, all along this time, I said to myself, maybe here are woods, here are this, that. Maybe I ought to make it into the trees and go away, and then, it's still summertime, it's still warm, I don't need those clothes. I'll try anything except go and be shipped somewhere else, And at that time, I remember my friend Yankel. He made it into the woods. But of course, I learned later he did not survive. They caught him because it took many more weeks before the Russians entered that Latvia and the Baltic states. But of course, in the meantime, we were again packed into freight cars and shipped to Stutthof. And there we stayed just for a short time. They shipped us to Buchenwald. And in Buchenwald, again, it was an experience, a very short experience, because they kept us there just in transit, waiting to be transported to where labor is needed, So after that, they transported us to Gelsenkirchen. The labor was very hard over there. It was inside, smoky, full of smoke. Factories, when I say full of smoke, because they had these large ovens where they would, heat metal to the color of white. When it was red, it was already too cool to be then picked up and put into presses, dies, to form shells. Then later on they would machine them, polish them up and all that, but that was the initial stage. And I was put to do that with a pair of long pliers, prongs. Lots of people did not make it. They did not know how to pick up a big block of about 16 kilos. And then, of course, air raids by the Allied forces, the British, the Americans, I wouldn't know who. This was a wonderful relief, because every time they blew the siren, everybody in the factory, Germans and the inmates, we would run for shelter there in the underground. Generally speaking, the Germans who worked with us, like those in charge, the civilians, they were okay people, There was one who was exceptional. He would occasionally go over and give me a little sandwich of his own food, because the Germans were also rationed out their food, But tragically not, he got killed during the last air raid, where the Allies made spaghetti, hanging spaghetti of the entire factory, meaning pipes and everywhere. Next day we saw such a relief. And of course, during the raid, what do you think I did? I went plundering for food. Where I knew in the camp where food was stored, I got a hold of a big salami, hid it, stuck it in a few other things, breads, whatever I could stick under my coat, Well, towards the end, the Allies, we all the time could not understand. We heard in the distance all the exchange of bombardments. But for some reason, the Allies did not move. It was so frustrating. And one fine day, the Germans decided to evacuate us. Apparently they sensed that the Allies were coming. They put us again back into freight cars, shipped us back to Buchenwald. In Buchenwald, there was at that time hardly any food left. It was everything in disarray. Some sort of panic existed there. We sensed it even in the German guards, the military. They put us back into freight cars as the fronts, approached, and they shipped us eastward, didn't know where, and we were like this, stranded around 9 days. Eventually we were brought to Theresienstadt, or that is known as Terezin in Czechish. We were dumped there, and by that time I felt like I was really dying already, because I remember when I once looked in a mirror, I was, it's like you could see the bones, and the only flesh that was left on my face, I remember, was the nose. And here everything was very, you could see the bones very distinctly, no flesh, And there was no one in charge. Just left. Everybody, guards, whoever. And one day, the Russians came, the Russian army. They entered, and the nurses took us, whoever remained, and they washed us up, and they helped us into clean beds in a set-up hospital by the army. I said to myself, I made it. It was a very moving moment for me.
Do not ever say this road portends our doom, even though our days are gray and full of gloom. Never mind the blue obscured by cloudy skies. Lift up your chin and thunder forth, for we shall rise. This song was written with our blood and not with ink, and our blood shall not be washed down to look pink. 'Tis not the singing of a free and soaring bird. It is a song for generations to be heard. From lands of palm trees to far-off lands of snow, we are coming with our torment and our woe. And everywhere our blood has drained into the ground, our strength and valor shall triumphantly rebound. We'll have the morning sun to set our day aglow, and green yesterday shall vanish with our foe. But if perchance the sun might still remain eclipsed, do not despair, just clasp your brother fist in fist.
Well, how about that for conclusion?